when Jacob was running from his brother and speaking to God, making a deal with him, saying, hey God, if this God of Abraham and Isaac, the God of my grandfather and the God of my father, if you will do, and then he listed off 5 things that if God would do for him, then you will be my God. The selfishness of the man to say that if God would do these things that he'd already done and that he would continue to do, that God would be his God. It would be 20 years later when he'd come back to nearly the same point, struggle with an angel of the Lord, and from that point forward he would refer to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, my God. But I think he had a very different sense of what that meant than what he originally intended in that prayer, if you wish, 20 years before. Because God had gotten Jacob. Jacob hadn't gotten God. God had finally gotten Jacob. The God that fills the universe wants you. The God that fills the universe wants you. And you. And you. He wants to be your God. He wants you. And he's got a plan for each one of you that's unique, different for every other person in the room, different from every other person living on this globe, different from every person who's ever lived on this planet. And he's already taken you through a unique path that no one else has gone through. And he will take you down a path in the future that's different from everyone else's. Because he wants you. My story is different. Because he had a unique task for me. People have often asked, Christians have very often asked, how did you make it through secular university? University of Chicago, Harvard University, and keep your faith? They asked that for many years, and I was puzzled by the question. I couldn't understand the question. Because it seemed to me there was nothing unusually difficult about holding my faith during my college years. Nothing at all. I said, well, everyone struggles, if you wish, in the Christian life. I don't think my struggles were any different than anyone else's. But as I thought about it, I realized I watched many of my friends, many people I knew, give up their faith or seem to give up their faith. So I began to ask, why did I not give up my faith? What was different? And it became evident to me that what was different was God had taken me on a particular task, on a particular path leading to college that put me in a position where my faith was never challenged. By the time I had reached college, I had already been challenged in my faith. God had already gotten me. For most of my friends, for most of those others who departed from the faith, God had not yet gotten them by the time they got to college. I dare say in my experience in over 20 years teaching college students that most of you have not yet been gotten by God. He's there, and he's holding you, and he's already set in motion your life so far and has set in motion that which is to come, but you still have not allowed him to get you. That trouble, that difficulty I went through was in 2 steps, 2 periods of time, one in my grade school years and one in my high school years that brought me to the point where he got me. The first one was in grade school. I was raised in a Christian home, always went to church. I think I have been in church from pre-birth. I was going to church when I was in mom's womb all the way through. But the period of time that I'm speaking of, that was all almost irrelevant to me. The question that I was trying to address in those years, and this is a period of about 1.5 years and intensely for a year, was, what do I really know for sure is true? For some reason, and it's unique, it's weird, I know it's not too many people do this kind of thing, but for me, I needed to know what was true. I wanted to grab onto what was true, but I wanted to be sure it was true. I spent most of my time in those years up in tree houses. We lived in the woods, and I spent a lot of my time in the trees. And most of what I'm about to account for you occurred in tree houses over the course of about a year's time. I'm going to condense it very, very briefly and make it sound like it's much shorter, but it was a long, difficult journey for me. I'd sit there in my treehouse and watch a squirrel jump from one branch to another and ask myself, do I know for sure that the squirrel exists? How do I know that the squirrel exists? Now, the only way I know that the squirrel exists is because I see the squirrel with my ears. With my ears, yeah, right. With my eyes. But I don't see the squirrel with my ears. I don't see the squirrel with my shoulder. I don't see the squirrel with my knee. I only see the squirrel with my eyes. How do I know for sure that the squirrel really does exist? My eyes could be deceiving me. I already had experience with my eyes deceiving me in various and sundry ways. How do I know for sure that the squirrel exists? Well, one day I was in my treehouse watching a squirrel jump from one branch to another and noted that I could hear the branches move in sync with the squirrel's jumping. I thought, ooh, wait a minute. If my eyes are deceiving me into thinking the squirrel exists when it really doesn't exist, then I shouldn't be able to hear with my ears the branches move at the same time. So it must be that the squirrel exists. Unless, what if there's something that is controlling both my ears and my eyes into believing the squirrel exists when it really doesn't exist? I began to call that entity my imp, because an imp does impish things, and it would be an impish thing to make you believe something exists when it really doesn't exist. So perhaps it really doesn't exist, and my imp is making me think that it exists when it really doesn't exist. Well, one day I was walking down the path in the woods with my friend Lance, and Lance says, "Hey, look, a deer!" Not a big deal for me, except for, wait a minute. How do I know for sure that that deer exists? If the deer doesn't exist, and my imp has made me think that the deer exists when it really doesn't exist, then Lance wouldn't know the deer existed. So it must be that the deer exists. Yay! Unless, how do I know Lance exists? I mean, the only reason I know that Lance exists is because I can see, hear, touch. But that imp, that would be an imp, wouldn't it? Wouldn't it be an imp to create a Lance that didn't exist to convince me that a deer exists when it didn't really exist? I mean, that would be the work of an imp. So how do I know? What does exist? How do I know for sure that the things around me exist? How do I know that my mom and my dad exist? How do I know that the treehouse exists? How do I know that anything out there exists? It could all be a deception of my imp. And so one day I was sitting up in my treehouse and I decided, about the only thing I really know for sure is the existence of my imp and myself. Unless, how do I know I exist? I mean, could it be that a very clever little imp could create a me that doesn't exist, and then to get me from thinking about whether or not I exist, create a Lance that didn't really exist to make me convinced that a deer didn't exist? How do I know that I really exist? So, one Wednesday in my treehouse, I decided I knew for sure the existence of one thing, and that was the existence of evil. My imp was evil, no doubt about it. And I didn't know for sure if I really existed. I didn't know for sure if the universe existed. But I knew for sure that my imp existed, unless maybe your imp is actually the only thing that exists, and created my imp, which didn't really exist, to make me believe that and created a me that didn't really exist in order to make, and then create a lance that didn't really exist to make me think that a deer didn't. I mean, I don't really even know if my imp exists. But even if I put everything back together again, and I assume the universe did exist, and my parents existed, and all that, I see evil there. If I deconstructed that, and took all of that out, I still see the imp, which is evil. Even if my imp doesn't exist, it'd be another imp that created the imp. So the one thing I knew for sure was the existence of evil. And so that day, I decided to commit suicide. I decided I would come back up into my treehouse 1 week later and decide the most efficient way to commit suicide, because committing suicide would be of one of two things. It would either be the killing of myself that didn't exist, in which case it wouldn't be anything at all, or it would be the destruction of evil, which would be good. So I concluded that suicide was a very good thing, the right thing to do. Well, in between the 2 Wednesdays, I went to Sunday school. It doesn't exist, but you do it, you know. And so I'm sitting there in Sunday school. I have no idea why I remember this, but the Sunday school teacher was talking about the third missionary journey of Paul, and he gets done with the thing, and he says, does anyone want to stay afterwards and accept Christ? Oh, I heard that a bunch of times. It's like, who cares? Doesn't exist. The story doesn't exist. The Sunday school teacher doesn't exist. We'll play along, getting to the next Wednesday. Everyone else leaves. The Sunday school teacher takes his Bible. It's interesting that when I talk to him years later about this, he doesn't remember doing this, and he insists that he never did this for anyone. But he very definitely did this for me. And it was bizarre. I had a Bible sitting in front of me, but he took his Bible, pushing my Bible out of the way, setting his Bible in front of me. And then he had it turned already to Romans chapter 3, and he recited Romans 3:23. For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God, and proceeded to explain to me, to try to explain to this 9-year-old kid, that I was a sinner. And I'm thinking, I don't remember, I follow what he was saying. I said, yeah, I'm evil incarnate. And he goes on and he turns the page to Romans 6:23. He recites, for the wages of sin is death. And he very carefully begins explaining to me that because I'm a sinner, the wages of that sin is death. And I'm thinking, not really paying much attention to what he's saying, gotcha, I'm committing suicide, I'm taking care of that. Then he turns to Romans 5:8. And he recites, but God commendeth or showeth his love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. I don't remember what in the world he was trying to explain at that point, because an epiphany. I realized all of a sudden that I didn't know just one thing. This is exciting. I knew 3 things. Because if evil was all that existed, then evil would not desire its own destruction. It would not make any sense. Evil would want its existence to continue. So I realized that I also knew not only that evil existed, but that evil must be destroyed, and that would be good. But the only reason that destroying evil would be good is if good existed. If evil was all that existed, then there wouldn't be no sense in which evil should be destroyed. So I realized all of a sudden, I was very happy that now I had gone from knowing one thing to knowing 3 things. Evil existed, good existed, and evil must be destroyed. And then I looked back